Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and Regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data.
Hello and welcome to episode 35. Today is part 3 of this look at Pax Brigade in 1815. And today we're looking at the 2nd Battalion of the 44th East Essex Foot. Now, the first thing to say is that their experience over the 3 days 16th to 18th of June was extremely similar to that of the 42nd Foot who we looked at last time, the Black Watch. So if you haven't watched that episode 34, then you should go and watch that first. I'm only going to briefly recap movements and events in this episode, otherwise I'll just be repeating myself. Instead, we'll hear accounts from the men of the 44th, and we'll also focus on what happened to these men in the years that followed. But as always, we'll begin by finding out who these men were. Now, the 44th East Essex Foot were one of those British regiments whose county name did not reflect the origins of its men. As we can see here, over 3/4 of the regiment were actually Irish. There's birthplace data for 78% of the 460 other ranks, and we can see here that 272 were Irish, 82 English, 3 Scots, 1 Welshman and 1 foreigner. Of the Englishmen, the most common counties were Worcestershire and Lancashire, almost half of the Englishmen coming from those two counties alone. And there were just 4 men recorded as being from Essex. Of the Irish regions, there are a handful of men from most of Ireland's counties, but the 10 most common are listed here. Tipperary in 3rd place, then Dublin and Queen's County, now named Laois, having more men in the ranks than any other. Now, for age, there's a birth date for 270 of the men, just under 60%, and the mean birth date is 1787, so aged 28 in 1815. The oldest man for whom there's a record was Private Thomas Daly from Killamud, Roscommon. He was 54 in 1815, while the youngest was George Whelan, who, if the records are correct, was only 15 years old. Let's now have a quick summary of the 44th's history in this period. The regiment's 1st Battalion spent most of the war in Malta and around the Mediterranean, before campaigning in North America in 1814-1815. But we're talking about the 2nd Battalion, and they had been fighting almost non-stop for 5 years. Arriving in Portugal in 1810, they suffered severe casualties in the ensuing years, especially in 1812, when it took many casualties at the storming of Badajoz, and then endured the privations of the failed siege of Burgos and the retreat from that town. At one point, the battalion could muster only 42 men fit for duty, and many of the remaining sick and wounded were sent home. By February 1813, the battalion had been so reduced in officers and men that the survivors, numbering 350 all ranks, were reorganised into just 4 companies and amalgamated with another 4 companies of the 30th Foot, who were then in a similar state after similar experiences. And this amalgamated force was named the 4th Provisional Battalion. I mentioned this before in the episode on the 30th Foot, episode 19. That summer, this combined unit was relieved by the 59th Foot, who, incidentally, would nearly all be tragically killed in 1816. Watch episode 17 to hear that story. And the Provisional Battalion was sent home from Lisbon. Now, if we look at enlistment dates for the 2nd Battalion, we can see how the data relates to that peninsular history, there being an enormous intake in 1813. Over a quarter of the battalion, recruited to get the battalion back up to strength and refill the large holes in the ranks. But the 2nd Battalion were not home for long. Only 4 months after returning, they were off abroad again, this time as part of Graham's campaign in the Lowlands in 1814. They were present at the bombardment of Antwerp and the action at Merksem before taking part in the calamitous assault on Bergen op Zoom. You can go and find out in detail the fate that befell the 44th on that freezing night in March 1814 by watching episode 18 of this series. But in a nutshell, the battalion suffered severe casualties, and most of its force, despite fighting extremely courageously, was taken prisoner as part of a broader, humiliating defeat. What else do we know about the 2nd Battalion, 44th Foot? Well, like the Royal Scots and Black Watch, again, these were not tall men. Around 5'5" was probably the most common height. In the Peninsula, they'd been given the nickname the Little Fighting Fours, in acknowledgement of both their ferocity in battle and their small stature. And literacy levels were low, especially compared to the Scotsmen of the previous episode, the great majority of discharge papers being signed with a man's mark rather than a signature. Now let's join the 44th in Flanders in June 1815. With just 460 other ranks, the battalion was quite a bit smaller than the others in the brigade, about 3/4 the size of the other three. It was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Hamerton from Orchardstown, Tipperary, with Major George O'Malley from Castlebar, Mayo, second in command. There were 23 other combatant officers. Unusually, rather than having 10 captains, one commanding each of the 10 companies, the battalion in 1815 had only 4. Presumably, lieutenants commanded the remaining 6. As we heard last time, Pack's brigade arrived at the crossroads of Quatre Bras at around 3 p.m. The Royal Scots were detached and immediately sent forward, leaving the remaining 3 battalions to file down the Namur Road. The 92nd Foot, the Gordons, were nearest the crossroads, the 42nd, the Black Watch, in the centre, and the 44th, East Essex, furthest down the lane. These days, the edge of the road here is flat, but in 1815 there was quite a steep bank to the right, which provided some cover for the 3 regiments and provided a good rampart from which to fire. However, as we heard in the previous episode, the 42nd and 44th were hurried into the fields of tall crops, which lay here in this triangle of land between the Namur Road and the Charleroi Road. Some 400 yards to the south, both regiments emerged from these crops and came face to face with French infantry, with whom they engaged. It was some time after this initial encounter that both British regiments observed Allied lancers, Brunswickers and perhaps Belgians too, galloping past to the right. What neither regiment realised, however, was that the Allied cavalry were being pursued by a large body of French lancers. It's worth noting that both the Belgian dragoons and the French lancers wore a very similar green uniform. These French lancers pulled up, wheeled round and fell upon the rear of both the 42nd and 44th. Major George O'Malley later wrote,
"These lancers passed on our right flank in pursuit of the Brunswickers, so close that they actually were considered as of the same body, though some of the old soldiers of the 42nd and 44th appeared to know better, as they opened a sort of oblique fire upon them. These brave French lancers wheeled short round, and to the astonishment of Sir Dennis Pack and myself, they were close in our rear immediately and through our centre, cutting down several men before there was a conviction on the minds of any but the soldiers who first fired upon them that they were French."
The brigade commander, Sir Dennis Pack, who was with both regiments, desperately called the order to cease fire, thinking these men were firing upon Allies. But this grave error soon became apparent. Lieutenant Alexander Riddock in No. 9 Company later recalled,
"We, from their appearance, supposed them to be Belgians, from their uniform, and having been but a short time in the action, were still keeping the French army at bay with the bayonet. When the 2nd Battalion, 44th Regiment, were attacked in the rear by the Lancers, who were slaughtering our supernumeraries and our rear rank men."
However, according to Lieutenant Riddock, the experienced Peninsula veterans were able to see off the Lancers with a devastating volley.
"The rear rank faced right about and repulsed them with great loss. So well directed was the fire that few escaped from our rear."
Like the accounts in last week's episode, the impression these lines provide that the Lancers were seen off with little difficulty is not reflected in the casualties the 44th suffered, as we'll hear in a moment. A desperate fight took place for possession of the 44th's two colours, the regimental colour and the King's colour. The regimental colour was carried by Ensign James Christie. Aged 28, a Scotsman from the ranks, he'd previously been the regimental sergeant major before being commissioned. He received a terrible wound in his valiant defence of his colour. Riddoch recalls,
"One of these old grey-headed devils dashed through our centre, sending his lance in at the left eye of the senior ensign, James Christie, down through his face until it went through his tongue and under the jaw."
But Christie, though terribly wounded, fell onto the colour, preventing it from being carried away, and the Lancer was struck down. Meanwhile, Ensign Peter Cook, an Irishman aged 21, was killed while carrying the King's colour. Later, one of these two colours had been taken into the custody of a third ensign, Gillespie Dunleavy, also Irish and aged just 20. A French officer, disguising himself as a British officer of the staff by wrapping himself in a cloak, rode up to the square, bluffing his way past the 44th's bayonets. The Frenchman then attempted to snatch the colour from the young ensign. Dunleavy, realising what was happening, stabbed the Frenchman's horse in the stomach, which caused it to collapse, and the French officer was killed. Dunleavy not only retained possession of the colour, but also took the dead officer's repeater watch. Both the Black Watch and the East Essex eventually managed to form square and repel the French lancers. Riddoch describes the next movement and the heavy casualties incurred.
Immediately after this, the regiment retired about 50 or 60 paces, leaving two companies, or as many men under the command of an officer as would cover the front of the regiment, keeping up constant fire on the French advanced lines. By this time, 4 o'clock, our regiment was reduced to a mere skeleton, having lost in killed and wounded about 16 officers and upwards of 200 men.
Soon afterwards, new French cavalry attacks came thundering through the crops. This time, it was the armour-clad heavy cavalry.
Ere this time, a number of squadrons of French cuirassiers and lancers were sweeping the field in the rear, round and round every square, showing no mercy, dashing at and sticking the helpless wounded officers and men that unfortunately lay without the protection of the square. I could compare them to nothing but a swarm of bees.
At some point, losses had become so severe, especially among the officers, that the 42nd and 44th combined to form one square. Major O'Malley,
The 44th had very considerable loss in officers and men, as well as the 42nd, and both corps acted together as one regiment for most part of that day, under the immediate command of Sir Dennis Pack.
With this combined square essentially an island surrounded by a sea of French troops, it became very difficult to resupply ammunition from the rear. Lieutenant Riddoch recalls,
"The situation was made worse by our ammunition being intercepted by the frequent and daring charges of the French cavalry, round and round and in the rear of our little squares."
Also, with the French cavalry swirling around the beleaguered square, the two companies out skirmishing found themselves in danger of being cut off and massacred. Lieutenant Riddoch was with this small group out in the open and realised they had better get back to the safety of the rest of the regimented square. He led these men in a formation 4 deep with bayonets bristling.
I fought my way through the French cavalry until I reached the south side of the square of my regiment, but so hot and hard pressed was the regiment on all sides that I could obtain no admittance, and my ammunition being gone, we had no other alternative than to lie down close to the square and crave their friendly protection.
The day dragged on under a seemingly endless succession of French infantry attacks, artillery bombardments and further cavalry charges. Lieutenant Riddoch again.
About 6 o'clock, we again sustained a dreadful contest with a host of cavalry that threatened total destruction.
but Pack's infantry kept up a withering fire which decimated the French horsemen.
The loss the French cavalry sustained in this contest was immense. Several hundreds of men and horses covered the ground all around us.
This proved to be the final cavalry attack of the day, but the slaughter was not over, and the British infantry remained under French musket and cannon fire until around 8 o'clock in the evening. Very much like the Black Watch, the loss of command due to the number of casualties among officers and NCOs at Quatre Bras was devastating. Of the 25 combatant officers present, 21 were casualties, 2 killed and 19 wounded, including all 4 captains. And as we'll see in a moment, some companies also lost all of their sergeants. Although the number of casualties among the men was not as severe as that suffered by the Black Watch, proportionally, being a smaller battalion, 114 casualties at Quatre Bras was almost as serious. On the 17th of June, the 44th joined the retreat along the Genappe road to Waterloo. Any form of transport was welcome to exhausted and wounded men. Basil Jackson of the Staff Corps came across Captain Adam Bruff of the 44th riding on the limber of a Dutch cannon crowded with other wounded passengers.
I discovered Bruff of the 44th, who told me his division had been severely handled, but had held its ground, that he himself had got hit and was besides knocked up by their forced march of 20 miles before getting into action, and therefore but too happy to profit by the good nature of the Dutch drivers.
Throughout the 17th of June, the brigade commander, Sir Dennis Pack, must have been assessing the state of his battered brigade. He must surely have been aghast at the losses in officers in the 2 regiments caught by French cavalry in the High Corn, and realised that for the subsequent day's fighting that the 42nd and 44th were now effectively a spent force, and could at best be called upon only as an emergency reserve. There were pretty much no recorded accounts of the 44th on the 18th of June, and so it seems likely that they were still amalgamated with the Black Watch and, as we heard last time, kept some way to the rear. Here they suffered casualties from French cannon fire, but probably were not heavily engaged with either French infantry or cavalry. That's my guess, anyway. It's hardly any surprise that no officer of the 44th left an account of Waterloo. Almost none of them were there. Being wounded at Quatre Bras, most would have spent the 18th of June lying wounded in Brussels. Let's now look at a few statistics and stories from each of the 10 companies. The numbers here for killed or died of wounds are hopefully accurate, but the numbers of wounded are probably incomplete, there being a few wounded men for whom no record survives. Having said that, the figures from the data I've collected turns out to be pretty similar to the official figures. The official regimental record states that 24 other ranks were killed over the 2 days fighting and 151 wounded. My figures I've added here in brackets in red are 30 killed, that's because that includes men who later died of wounds, and 131 men for whom there's a record of being wounded. So let's have a quick look. The figures here for each company are just for the other ranks, they don't include officers. Number 1 company. This was the Grenadier Company. It suffered the worst casualties in the battalion in terms of men killed. Only 3 men were killed outright, all at Quatre Bras. The other 7 fatalities dying of their wounds in hospitals in Brussels. Among these was Sergeant Robert Dick, one of the 3 Scotsmen known to be in the battalion. From Aberdeen, he was in hospital for over 7 weeks, finally dying on the 10th of August. Number 2 Company, no fatalities. With all of this company's officers fallen, either killed or wounded, command fell to the only sergeant still standing, Sergeant Richard Steele. From Inishmagrar in County Leitrim, he was a veteran of Salamanca and Badajoz and had been wounded on the ramparts of Bergen-op-Zoom. Unusually, his discharge papers make special mention of his gallantry and of his commanding the company at Waterloo. Number 3 Company. Sergeant William Payne was the battalion's only soldier listed as foreign, being born in the West Indies. However, he was not a black soldier. His description lists him as blue eyes with a fair complexion. At Waterloo, he was hit in the hand by the splinter of a shell, which disabled 2 fingers. Number 4 Company. The 2 officers who were killed at Quatre Bras are both listed as from this company. Lieutenant William Tompkins and Ensign Peter Cook. The latter, we heard, was cut down while carrying the King's colour. Number 5 Company. This company was commanded by Captain Mildmay Fane, who would later rise to become a Major General. He was wounded at Quatre Bras, as was the company's second-in-command, Lieutenant James Burke. Despite this wound, Burke was able to carry on and lead the company at Waterloo, until he was wounded again, this time severely. Number 6 Company. Again, the 2 men killed from this company both fell at Quatre Bras. Privates Joseph Baker from Lancaster and Edmund Connor from Kerry. All 4 sergeants of this company were wounded, 2 Irishmen, 2 Londoners. It's probably difficult to emphasise enough the devastating effect this would have had, being effectively rudderless amid the mayhem. Number 7 Company. With just 39 men, this was one of the smallest company strengths in the British Army at Waterloo. The story of Private John Bibby of this company is an extraordinary one. From the market town of Swaffham in Norfolk, he had, since enlisting in the 44th, become the Batman, the personal servant to Captain William Burney. It was in this capacity that he was court-martialled in July 1814, charged with stealing money from his master. Now, we've heard of many court-martials and floggings in this podcast series, and the range of punishment has generally been 100 lashes or thereabouts for relatively minor offences, rising to 300 for the most serious. Private Bibby, having been found guilty, was sentenced to an unheard of 800 lashes. This says so much about society and justice of the day. Theft among the working classes was one thing, but theft from the ruling classes was met with the most furious and vicious outrage. Private Bibby received 400 lashes, again an unheard of amount and probably on the very cusp of what might kill a man. Bibby returned to the ranks and at Quatre Bras or Waterloo was wounded. The poor man died of his wounds on the 4th of July. The story, however, does not end there. Every soldier in the British Army was awarded prize money for Waterloo, the amount dependent on rank. Each private received £2, 5 shillings and 3d. The prize money of men killed in action or died of wounds was paid to their next of kin. Incredibly, Captain Burney came after Bibby's prize money that would have gone to support his grieving widow or parents. The prize money allocation was handled by the Chelsea Hospital Board, and their correspondence contains letters to and from Lord Palmerston, who was then Secretary at War organising the finances of the army, instructing that Bibby's money should be paid to Captain Burney. For some context, £2, 5 shillings in 1815, what was due a private soldier, would be equivalent to something like £250 today, while the prize money awarded to a captain would be over £10,000 in modern terms. Number 8 Company. Again, no fatalities in this company. Among the wounded was Private Patrick Power, presumably Paddy Power, from the village of Nerney in Tipperary. He'd been soldiering since 1799 and fought through every action in which the battalion was engaged in the Peninsula. His discharge papers note that he had behaved in the most gallant manner. Number 9 Company. This company suffered the worst overall casualty rate, 53%. The wounded included Private Elijah Paget from King's Winford in the Midlands. He was hit in the thigh by a musket ball and was later discharged due to this wound. And we'll hear more about him later. And finally, number 10 Company. Lieutenant Robert Greer of this company was an Irishman aged 22 in 1815. He had a dog which was a great favourite with all in the 44th, accompanying the battalion since a puppy. Both Greer and the dog were wounded at Quatre Bras and were later found in Brussels, bandaged up beside each other. The story of Private John Riley of this company from Drumland, County Cavan, It's one of those intriguing dark tales where to have only some of the facts is both tantalising and frustrating. The records show that only 5 days after Waterloo, he killed a German soldier, a Ludolf Meyer of the 1st Foreign Veteran Battalion, by shooting him. Court-martialed at Antwerp in August, Riley was found guilty of murder and sentenced to be hanged by the neck until he be dead. The rest of the details are lost. What happened? Why? Perhaps we'll never know. But the sentence was carried out, and Private Riley was executed on the 7th of January. After Waterloo, the regiment spent only 6 months as part of the Army of Occupation. During this time abroad, newspapers from home were highly prized and eagerly awaited, but the papers at the end of the year brought the most terrible news: an announcement from the War Office that all 2nd Battalions were to be disbanded. This was devastating for the officers and men who had fought so determinedly across Portugal and Spain, and whose colours had been the first to be planted on the ramparts of both Badajoz and Bergen-op-Zoom, with such a high cost in life and limb. The officers of the battalion wrote a long and emotive letter to the Duke of York, the commander of the British Army, elucidating their triumphs and glories and beseeching His Royal Highness to make an exception due to their distinguished service. The letter was posted from Calais on January the 4th, 1816. The battalion then shortly embarked for England. One can imagine the mood must have been extremely gloomy. And by 18th of January, were waiting for a reply, stationed now in Dover. On the 22nd of January, the much-anticipated reply arrived from the Duke of York. He was sorry, but he could make no exceptions, and that was that. 2 days later, the battalion was disbanded, every fit man being transferred to the 1st Battalion. The regiment would serve the next 6 years in Ireland. During this posting, the regiment was usually broken up into very small detachments spread out across an area, just a handful of men in each hamlet and village. We can see, for example, this distribution of men when posted to Kilkenny in 1818. Written records of the social unrest in this period are extremely sparse, particularly so in Ireland. It's often difficult to find any mention in the newspapers of events which took place. The discharge papers of ordinary soldiers of this period often refer to incidents which have long been forgotten by history. Take, for example, Private William Stewart of No. 8 Company at Waterloo. The reason given for his discharge in 1819, aged 26, is vertigo, which is directly accredited to a blow from a stone which struck him on the right temple when employed in quelling a riot at the fair of Urlingford. Urlingford you see here, his detachment numbering just 20 men. Now I've been unable to find any record of this riot, and one can only wonder how incomplete the record is of the level of insurrection which these men of the 44th were tasked with stifling. As you'll know by now if you've watched previous episodes, these post-Waterloo years were not only extremely volatile in terms of social upheaval and violence, they were also years which saw a huge reduction in the size of the army. In the 6 years after Waterloo, over 200 of the remaining Waterloo men in this battalion were discharged. Several of the discharged Waterloo men decided to emigrate to Canada. There were opportunities and offers of land to be taken up there for those who wished to embark on a new adventure. You can see these men here. I think we talked about this in a previous episode. It's notable that all of the men who took up this offer in the 1830s were Irish, presumably not unconnected with the levels of hardship and hunger in Ireland in that decade. In 1822, orders came that the regiment was to be posted to India. The opportunity was taken to discharge some of the more weak and sickly men with the reason unfit for East India service. However, being a robust and healthy soldier was to prove little defence against the ravages of illness that greeted the regiment on their arrival at Calcutta in early November 1822. Some men died within days of arriving. Lieutenant Ralph Twinbarrow, for example, one of the few officers not wounded at either Quatre Bras or Waterloo, died on the 22nd of November and was buried at North Park Street Burial Ground, Calcutta. Over the next 2 years in particular, outbreaks of typhoid and cholera devastated officers and other ranks alike. In 1824, the regiment moved to Chittagong, now modern-day Chattogram in Bangladesh, and from there took part in the invasion of Burma, in what was then named the Arakan Campaign, but is now referred to as the First Burma War. Casualties in combat were almost non-existent, but devastating numbers of men died from disease. Among the hundreds who lost their lives between 1824 and 1826 were 43 Waterloo men, including 18 who survived the horrors of Badajoz and Burgos. And the survivors of illness lost not only comrades, but also beloved family. Private John Leddy from Castle Terror, County Cavan, lost his wife Susan, while Private James Rogers lost his infant daughter Jane, just 6 months old. The burial ledgers across British India brim with similarly tragic tales. By the 1830s, there were only 14 Waterloo men left in the ranks. Doubtless all of these men had quite extraordinary lives. Most had served in the Peninsula, most had been taken prisoner at Bergen, and most had served through all of the Burma campaign in 1825. Adam Dumas from Achaloha, Fermanagh, a corporal in No. 5 Company in 1815, had been wounded at Bergen op Zoom, then wounded again at Quatre Bras, through the thigh by a musket ball and behind the right shoulder by a lance. He survived both wounds and served another 16 years in the regiment, being promoted to sergeant during the campaign in Burma. Private Patrick Ferguson from Kilnaboy, County Clare, had been just a lad of 19 at Bergen op Zoom, where he was charged with taking the regimental colours out of the citadel and escaping to the British lines. This he had done, ensuring they were not captured. At Waterloo, he'd received a musket ball in the thigh. Private Edward Preston from Wexford lost his brother Alexander at Quatre Bras, killed while fighting in No. 3 Company. Edward had already survived being wounded at Salamanca in the head and being captured at Bergen. He was discharged in 1837 after 33 years' service. Sergeant Cottrell Little from Dublin sounds an impressive character. Part of the forlorn hope in the storming of Badajoz in 1812, he was also among those captured at Bergen op Zoom. His discharge papers, unusually, contained the additional note,
"This man has been in the field with his regiment in almost every action in which it was engaged, and at all times conducted himself as a gallant soldier."
And the last 2 Waterloo men in the ranks were discharged on the same day, the 30th of September 1840, at Karnal in the very north of India. They were Joseph Wright from Lawford in Warwickshire. A boy of only 17 at Waterloo, he'd already seen action at Bergen. He'd risen to sergeant, but was court-martialled and reduced back down to private in 1829. The other man was Maurice O'Meara from Dublin. He'd enlisted as a drummer at Guernsey in 1807, aged only 14. He served through the Peninsula at Salamanca and Badajoz, and then Flanders in 1814. His discharge papers comment that his conduct had been good, but that he was inclined to drink. The 2 men sailed home on different ships, Joseph finally stepping back onto home soil at Gravesend in May 1841, and Maurice, the last man home, the following month. They had chosen a good time to leave the regiment. A few days later, the 44th set off from Karnal to march to Kabul in Afghanistan, where they would ultimately suffer total annihilation, perhaps the greatest disaster in the history of the British Army. You can hear some of that story in episode 20. And what of the officers? Well, Lieutenant Colonel Hamerton, Major O'Malley, Captain Mildmay Fane and Lieutenant John Campbell all rose to become Major Generals, glittering careers of wealth and prestige. At the absolute other end of the scale, poor Ensign James Christie, he who had suffered the terrible lance wound through his eye, tongue and chin, seems to have committed suicide. His story shows that a man might rise from the ranks, but in this era it was extremely easy to fall back into destitution. In September 1844, the Dundee Courier published an appeal for Jean Christie, James's sister.
Ensign Christie died a number of years ago by his own hand. the consequence, it is understood, of a mental infirmity caused by the wound received at Waterloo. Since the death of her brother, who was her sole dependence, Jean Christie has been in the greatest poverty. She is now a frail old woman, a pauper of the parish.
Let's now finish with some of the last Waterloo men standing. We heard earlier of Elijah Paget from King's Winford in the Midlands, one of the many casualties in No. 9 Company. In 1878, the Midlands newspapers published the following story.
The funeral of a man named Elijah Paget, 86 years of age, late private of the 44th Foot, took place at West Bromwich on Monday. The deceased took part in the Battle of Waterloo, where he received 2 severe wounds, which partly disabled him for the remainder of his life, about 63 years. The deceased carried with him to the grave a bullet which he received at Waterloo, medical skills having been thwarted in endeavouring to extract it from his thigh. On his discharge from the army, the deceased was granted a pension of 1 shilling and 6pence a day, which he received up to the time of his death.
The following year, 1879, William Burney passed away. This was the captain who took the prize money from Private John Bibby's next of kin. Burney, by now Colonel Sir William Burney, died at Elgin Crescent, Kensington, aged 88. But I think the last man standing was an extraordinary character, Private Thomas Brooks from Worcestershire. He'd enlisted aged 18 in 1812 and served in the Peninsula. In 1815, he was wounded in 5 places and subsequently underwent the amputation of an arm. He was thus discharged in April 1816, still aged only 22. Extraordinarily, his profession was that of a nailer, one that I would have ignorantly supposed to be particularly unsuited to a one-armed man. But that seems to be the trade he continued to pursue. He lived in Old Swinford near Stourbridge, where in 1857, aged 63 and listed as a nailer, he was charged at the magistrates' course with maliciously stabbing a John Tonks at Old Swinford on the 18th of May. The proceedings of the court were described thus.
Mr. Powell, for the defence, said that the prosecutor was willing, in consideration of the prisoner's age and his having lost an arm in the service of his country, he is a Waterloo man, that if the prisoner would plead guilty to common assault, to forego the more serious charge. To this the prisoner assented, and the Right Honourable Chairman, having read through the depositions, said that under the circumstances he would inflict a fine of £1. The prisoner said he had no money, and was therefore ordered to be kept in prison till it was paid. Upon this Mr. Powell generously paid the amount, and the old man was set at liberty.
In April 1863, Thomas was admitted to the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, to be an in-pensioner, but he can't have taken to institutionalised life, or perhaps they not to him, and he reverted to being an outpatient. A final date in pencil on his pension papers is presumably his date of death, the 5th of May, 1880. So let's leave the 44th Foot there. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a link below which you can click on to support the podcast, buymeacoffee.com. 1,000 thanks indeed to those of you who've already done so. I really appreciate it. And speaking of being indebted, sincere thanks as always to those kind volunteers who read the extracts for this episode. Next time, we'll finish off this look at Pax Brigade by turning to another kilted regiment, the 92nd Foot, more famously known as the Gordon Highlanders. But until then, many thanks for listening.